Hello, my name is Michael Berger, and I have an associate's degree in mechanical engineering and a bachelor's degree in digital science. I have a certificate in AutoCAD and cybersecurity. I worked as a student IT assistant at the University of Akron, a math tutor at Stark State College, SMT operator at Airborne Electronics, and as a student team leader at Kent State University in the fan-rated desktop support department.
And my name is Gregory Hess. I have a bachelor's degree in digital sciences from Kent State University. I have a Test Down Security Pro certification, as well as numerous certifications through LinkedIn courses. I've held numerous IT positions in end user support across Kent State, Beechwood Systems, and Northeast Ohio, and in my local area, in local town of Northeast Ohio, as I reside. And I'm en route to a rotational in Brooklyn, Ohio, this coming summer. And today we have a special guest with us as to our podcast listeners. This is our first guest to our very own podcast environment, so we're very familiar with our guest as he is an information systems professor at our alma mater of Kent State University, Dr. Pratim Datta. He has served as the PhD director for the College of Business from 2012 to 2018. He has served as the college's as part of the Kent State's Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business Accreditation Assurance of Learning lead from 2010 to 12. In his time before academia, Dr. Datta has held many positions at places like IBM, SAP, and PricewaterhouseCoopers. He has 75 plus different articles and has spoken internationally at numerous spots, surrounding his work in numerous areas of MIS, information science, and innovations, alongside 11 sole inventions. You can see his latest case study on the SolarWinds attack that we've covered on the TechIT podcast on Amazon now, as well as more at his website or his profile at scholar.google.com, as we talk about the current and future state of ransomware today. Now, on with the podcast.
Welcome to the TechIT podcast. I'm your host, Mike Berger, and I'm here with my co-host, Gregory Hess, and our guest professor, Dr. Dater. Here at the IT podcast, I would like to wish all the fathers a happy Father's Day. How are you guys doing this week?
I'm doing well. Sorry, you have to forgive my excitement. I buzzed a bit too soon. Thank you. Happy Father's Day to everybody and to my wonderful, clever, and extremely qualified and super talented hosts. I wish them a lovely Father's Day ahead too. I'm doing well. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing
pretty good.
Doing quite well. Have you guys have anything planned this weekend or anything fun going on?
It's interesting. What do I have fun going on? Well, other than possibly go out take the kayak out. I don't think, and just make sure that I don't tip it over and drown. I think that would be a good fun day for me.
Agreed. Drowning is always not drowning is always a good day. Greg, how's your week going? Do you have anything exciting to share with us?
Yeah, I've been officially on label hired as part of my rotational program coming this July with this corporate office in Brooklyn, Ohio. That'll start in July. So wheels are turning as I'm trying to figure out the best way to get downtown as I don't really like driving downtown. But in Cleveland that is, because that's where the requisite training's going to be. So it's going to be interesting. Plus I get to find out more stuff about my car that I bought back in April. So
exciting. Well, congratulations on the official job title there and the position. I think we should go ahead and head into the Q&A because I think it's going to take up a good portion of our show today. And let's just start off with our first question for Dr. Datta here. Dr. Datta, how can you define ransomware for our listeners?
Yes, yeah, of course. I think the best way to start off is by mentioning what it is. I think everybody gets edgy every time they hear the next ware coming down. It used to be shareware and freeware, and then now you've got ransomware. Well, ransomware to a certain degree is nothing but some kind of a malicious software that is embedded into some organization system, which basically sort of denies access to organizational information tech, as well as mainly a lot of organizational data. And then what they typically do is the malicious attackers will get in embed some kind of malicious code and then say, well, if you don't cough up some money, you cough up some money and then we'll send you a decryption key and then you can get access to your data. So simply put, as if they lock you out of your building and you can't get in unless you've actually paid a ransom.
That's a wonderful answer to our question there. As someone in cybersecurity or looking to get into cybersecurity, I know that a good way to deal with not only ransomware attacks but attacks in general is to have a procedural doc. What are your thoughts on procedural docs for ransomware or any other sectors? Like, what would that look like if you could just even give us the basics?
Well, a procedural doc in terms of preventing it. So you've got procedural docs in terms, if you ask some kinds of actor who's planning on setting up an attack or an attack vector, they will give you a very different procedural doc, which is going to be, I'm going to figure out where the stagecoach goes so that we can get some outlaws back in motion, versus the ones who are practicing defense in depth will, on the other hand, say, right, okay, should we hire some Pinkertons to tackle them or not? So let me try and give sort of a tangential response to it before you can ask me something a bit more detailed. So, I must say that ransomware is on more of the gravity of the matter. It is the average attack in the last couple of years, especially with digital transformation, has been about on average of $4.6 million per ransomware attack. And that, of course, includes everything from paying the ransom with the ones who demand ransom, the lost business time, all the idea behind cyber insurance that you have to pay for it, response management, mitigation. But the procedure for ransom, at least for tackling this, one of the main things is, of course, there are human sides. So managing the procedural doc is a procedural doc that tackles both the human aspects, the process aspect, and the technical aspect. Other than the zero-day technical exploits, typically most of these hacks begin by scouting the periphery. Who are the vendors? What are their systems? What are the endpoints? Are they unsecured? Can we leverage the software supply chain? And then, of course, there's phishing and spear phishing. With a really prolific dark web and a footprint-proof set of browsers nowadays that you find, and some of them came out as open source licensing, including like an MIT open license scheme like Tor and I2P that use a bunch of encrypted random relays. The setup for malicious actors is they want to put information out for sale. There is information out for sale, and for hackers, the question is, how do they collect that information from the darknet or from darknet marketplaces and put it into action? So the procedure goes back into very much like how anytime a separate operation is done. You scan, you scout, you find vulnerabilities in either the process, in the people, or in the technology, or all of the above. and then launch a multi-pincer attack on them.
Well, that was a very descriptive answer to that question. I love it. Let's go and dive into our next question here. Unless you have something to say about that, Greg, do you have any more points?
Because it's telling with ransomware these days, as because I've subscribed to this Hacker News Now newsletter where I get a lot of deliberations and news stories coming in about stuff in the tech news and world. So, as we've covered already here on the TechIT podcast, ransomware is always around. It's been prevalent, almost a 200% increase from 2019 to 20, actually, according to the cyber network group Cloudflare. So, the best way what are the main key points for ransomware prevention in summary?
Yeah, sure. So ransomware, if you're talking about preventing it, of course, prevention is the best defense. I say that there are 4 specific steps to tackle it. The first one, and I'll elaborate on each of them. The first one is, of course, identify. Identify what you have to know what you can prevent. If you don't know what you have, you won't be able to prevent what's there already. Second is, once you know what you have, then secure them. Figure out different ways to secure them. Third, once you secure them, make sure you now have backups for them, so that just in case, even the most secure location can be cracked. And that is why you need to have backups. And then finally, just in case, there might be some kind of a force majeure, whether it's a disaster or whether it's multifaceted, multi-pronged attack on your system, you have to find a way to get back into business continuity. And for that, you need to have cyber insurance. So going back to it, identify. One of the things I always find is that when I talk to companies, they have loads and loads of data. They have loads and loads of devices, but most of the time, if you ask them, do you have a proper categorical set of inventoried data and device matrix? They'll say, yes, we have it somewhere, but we don't always know exactly where they are right at our fingertips, but you need to know that. So asset management and comprehensive inventory management they become absolutely essential. They're sort of an imperative, not even essential. Then understand where your device, your application, and data assets lie. Applications are shared across multiple different things. Devices are brought in and brought out. They're entering different networks, even within a company, moving across networks. As that happens, so do applications and data. Data is your salient resource for every operation and strategy that you're doing. So if you don't figure out a way to know what they are, where they are, and when and how they're accessing the network and not accessing the network, you're going to be left at a bit of a loss. The next part of identification is identifying the data itself. What are the types of data that you have? And how do companies classify and valorize them? Valorize, of course, is the valuation of the data, right? And you valorize based on the sensitivity of the data, how mission critical they are, who uses it, who's checking it in, who's checking it out. It's important to know that. And I'm always appalled when I look at companies and I realize that they have this great data, but then they have these data stored as on some W server or an S drive somewhere. And every time I'm copying the data, there's no real logging mechanism. There's no authentication mechanism on who's accessing it. The S drive belongs to everyone. Creating these resource views and also understanding, therefore, that there is a mechanism to calculate the riskiness of the loss of data. And that comes from finance, and it's called VAR model or a VAR model, which is value at risk, where you look at the probability of an attack or the probability that the data is going to be accessed. And if it's accessed, what exactly is the impact or the financial impact of the company? And third is, where do your data reside? Do you know how many backups are there? If something is changed in the data, which do the backups automatically get changed? Is there a timestamp that's based on which data is written and rewritten? Um, Backups and instances are great, but it's important to know how secure these multiple instances are. For example, you can have an instance loaded on an open USB drive, but that is dreadful, right? You'd rather not have a backup on a USB drive. A USB drive could be misplaced, stolen, a legitimate file could be injected with malware, could be spoofed and phished to look like an organization communique by a
Right.
perpetrator. How do you check your data integrity? So, data integrity solutions. Now, we're not even going to get into things like blockchains, but of course, things like blockchains, the way they work with nonces and Merkle roots and previous hashes and post hashes is a way to ensure data integrity. But at the very preliminary level, ensure identity and access management for data, or else you could have multiple instances of the data, but you'd never really know which data was tampered with, which one is the credible one, and which one is the spoofed one. Then going back to security, once you've identified, you have to secure. When you're securing it, first encrypt. And encryption is so fabulously fascinating nowadays. And of course, we're talking about PKI setups in terms of encryption. We're not talking about private key encryption anymore, but we're talking about a public key infrastructure with both public keys and private keys and so forth. And then of course ensure that you have secure storage. Going back to integrity checking mechanisms, have audit logs, look at vulnerability management matrices.
Mm-hmm.
Where are things vulnerable? At what point could they be made vulnerable? How would you monitor them? How do you maintain the data? Once you've secured the data, then comes backup. Where do you back up? Who owns the backup? Who accesses the backup? How are these backups even staged? And how are they put into production? How do you ensure how backups are written? Are they cascaded automatically? Knowing that is essential. And finally, it is a world where, the best laid plans of mice and men. So, just in case the best laid plans of mice and men go awry, it's important to have some kind of a financial backup, not just data backup. And the financial backup comes from purchasing cyber insurance. If things do go pear shaped, how do you stay swimmingly on surface? How do you make sure that your business still runs? Everything else has operational validity, operational continuity, and in order to
Mm-hmm.
doing that, you need to have cyber insurance. It is getting to become a very murky world, and in this murky world, of course, one of the things that a lot of perpetrators demand is not only money, but also the time lost in getting back everything that was for operational continuity in general. So cyber insurance becomes very, very essential to a certain degree.
Well, sticking with the same area, uh, on cybersecurity here, let's kind of dive into how do we implement strategies like least permissions and zero trust principle to along the lines of ransomware protection.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's a bit of a paradox when we talk about least permission, zero trust principle. We can create systems that have zero trust, but sadly, the people who
Mm-hmm.
use that system end up being trustworthy individuals, right? They love trusting others. We love trusting people. And when we're driving a car, we merrily change lanes because we know that others are going to follow our signaling and know that, all right, slow down because the other driver's changing lanes. But the weird thing is that zero trust at a system level is only a minimal privilege. So zero trust, of course, least permission comes out of something called POP, which is principle of least privilege. So it's a great minimal privilege policy solution that restricts users to access resources only under the job purview. Not brilliant, we totally agree that. All right, fantastic. Great policy. But still does not contain things like spearfish compromises, right? I can access, suppose I or you can only access the data that you are given to access. However, you're accessing it via a phone where your phone is not password protected or might have a password protection where you use one of those gimmicky sets where you run your finger and then it, of course, lets you in. And frankly speaking, that's so easy to figure out for anybody who's sort of shoulder sniffing or basically trying to take a peek at what you're doing, whether it's by their camera phone and they look like they're looking somewhere else. It looks like they're looking somewhere else, but their phones recording every single stroke you're making. Suddenly, if your phone's compromised, it doesn't matter if you've got this principle of least privilege.
Right.
The device itself could be the biggest weakness in the chain, and not just the device, but the person who's using the device. So companies use these privilege bracketing that tries to limit access time, which is great. But going back to it, today you could easily write a script that could access things way faster than an individual does. So even if you do a time trace and say, well, for somebody to get into this network, go through 3 different folders, go through 560 files in these 3 folders, it would take this much amount of time. But frankly speaking, you can easily have a bot. So privilege bracketing oftentimes becomes a tricky part of the puzzle. Once again, it's a lovely policy, but a malicious bot could run a script in that time. Still, I have to say, zero trust, using context-specific least privilege access, using things like microperimeters, which is granular resource protection rather than entire network environment. This goes back into what we were chatting about previously, which is if you know how to valorize your data, you don't need to focus on protecting the entire network and every single asset in it, but perhaps protect the ones that have the most or the greatest vulnerabilities, right, or most mission critical. So creating microperimeters become much more important. That's where you're also not using up too many organization sort of intrusion detection resources trying to map the entire perimeter, but knowing that these are fault areas, and these are the gaps we need to fill. Similarly, you can do microsegmentation with segregating network environments into discrete ones or sectors based on different functionalities, criticalities of the business, very much like process microsegment, which I absolutely believe that companies are to do. Think of your process microsegments, which parts of the process in your company are dangerous, where the attack can happen, rather than functional microsegments. So don't break it down into, oh, well, let's make sure that finance is well set up. Yet the data flows between HR and finance all the time, or HR and operations all the time, or finance and operations. What happens when you've secured one but forgotten to secure the other part? So it's better to do microsegmentation based on processes rather than on a specific function. In addition, I think object storage setups are becoming great prudent steps for things like data immutability, where you can't modify any file in place. It's known as in-place modification, where you just write over the existing file. But in this the new object storage setups, you can every time you write anything, anybody logs into it, you create a new version of it with a user log and a timestamp. So we can even think of, like Google Docs or Microsoft OneDrive or Amazon S3s and so forth, where every time every single version is kept. That's where if one version is hijacked, the other versions still remain active unless that entire access area is hijacked in the first place. So other than object versioning, you can also practice object locking to stop any kind of access. So you could very much like the way you can do your credit locks. You could actually lock your social security number from being accessed by just going into like Experian and TransUnion and saying, I want my credit locked. That way, even if somebody has access to your social security number and want to apply a card in your name, they can't because you've locked all credit checks altogether. So very similar to that. But the most important is the growth of AI and analytics to assess user interactions and identify laxities and bot behaviors. So that's where human sort of a priori planning is not working because bots, these dangerous bots are getting smarter and smarter over time. But of course, AI is coming in to help a lot by saying, well, maybe we can spot these tiny nuances, tiny idiosyncrasies, tiny peculiarities that we can say, right, we think that is a bit of an intrusion. That is somebody trying to copy something that may or may not have the privilege. So those bits, I think that, again, least permission, the pulp principle, the zero trust principle, great ideas, but at the end of the day, it's always the processes and the users that can sort of make the most fortified setups vulnerable.
Right, because there's a lot of facets involving what as you mentioned, companies, sort of like big and small, regarding just general exposure to these sort of new attacks, as we've mentioned and covered on the podcast before. The great abundance that ransomware has had on things that may not be covered by that many people, but it still happens. But I want to get your take on this, Dr. Datta, as I've seen numerous takes on this. What do you think is the best practice for a company right now in this age of ransomware botnets and the like? Would it still be safe to use physical media storage at places big and small, or cloud media storage provided by such services like the S3 and AWS or Amazon Web Services, or like Google Cloud and Azure and Microsoft and Google, respectively?
Well, physical storages are great, right? But physical storage, of course, have a chance of being tampered with. Where exactly does the physical storage reside? Does it reside as a local instance? Who exactly manages it? Who controls it? Who has access to it? Frankly speaking, as long as you have good backups, it's good practice, right? It's a great idea to have physical storage combined with cloud storage. Simply relegating security to pure technology, there was a researcher called Peltzman who once talked about something called the Peltzman effect, where when you depend too much on one thing, especially on technology, you tend to forget that there are other issues at play. And when you aren't mindful of that, that's when you start throwing caution into the wind and becomes dangerous. But the cloud is generally it's pretty secure spot for backups. Because you have issues like downtime, latency, and you're handing over control to somebody else, the cloud is generally secure. Yet, as we've chatted previously, processes matter. I think I was once joking and saying, and again, you could have the car with the best safety crash rating in the world, but if you're a lousy driver, nothing matters. So how you drive the car is more important than all the cool technologies that a car has or the great crash ratings that a car has. So knowing what best practices are and what to back up. Should you back up applications? Because you should be doing all of these configurations, logs, how to encrypt, where to do your multi-factor authentication. And again, I'm a big believer in multi-factor authentication, not only at an application level, but at a device level. Right now, most of the MFA, multi-factor authentication, happens at an application level, right? Which basically means that if somebody has access to your phone, I try to sign on to a site and they send me a notification via Microsoft Authenticator, something very similar, and Authenticators on the phone too. I just open it up. Even weirder is oftentimes they'll send me an OTP, a one-time password. And guess what? As I'm waiting to input the one-time password, my iOS convenience setup allows to even pull it from the latest message that's come through and say, is this the number you'd like to put in? And all I have to do is, do a little bit of tactile movement and voila, I'm into the system. So I personally believe it's important to create a new form of engagement at multi-device authentication rather than purely multi-factor authentication at a single
Right.
device level. Similarly, logging, monitoring, access control, knowing when to back up, the periodicity of the backups, how to recover, which instance should you use for recovery, where these instances lie, which instances can you actually trust, which instances should you not trust that much, right? So again, it's always good to have it in multiple sets, but it's very important, very much like having friends. It's good to have many friends, but it's also good to know which friend to access at the right time. The go-to, right? Very much like that. In order to protect yourself, you've got to build a go-to setup. And I wanted to quickly mention was that you, I think you've covered our evil, the famous ransomware group. They attacked Hoppenbrouwer's system. Hoppenbrouwer is a big Dutch company that does a lot of electrical and stuff and so forth for very large companies. But they used the Kaseya, the virtual systems administration attack, that was very similar to the Cozy Bear SolarWinds at Orion Server sunburst attack. So what a lot of these cyber hackers are doing, especially with ransomware, is rather than hitting the spokes, they're hitting the hub. And both of these hubs, whether you're talking about SolarWinds, which provides infrastructure services, and Kaseya, which also provided virtual system services, the variation of a zero-day vulnerability. Right? Zero-day attack looks at existing software, supply chain vulnerabilities on the day a software is released, and before anything can be patched, the attack comes in. Now with Kaseya and REvil, where the REvil ransomware, I think it was called Agent CRT, exploited their system and bypassed authentication, what encrypting and systems and denying access, unless their terms where Kaseya come on, pop up 70 million quid or so. Of course, the malware used a lot of obfuscation to avoid detection by IDS, registers, flags. Yet, an interesting thing was that Kaseya knew of the vulnerability for 3 months, right, around April. I think this happened in July or so. And before it was exploited in the wild, there's a common vendor negligence though, and Kaseya BSA. So talking about how cloud protected them, this attack impacted 1,500 clients. Now, one of these clients was, of course, Hoppenbrouwer. Now, when Hoppenbrouwer one evening tried to access its systems, it couldn't. But what they realized is, we've got an interesting backup already from the previous Friday. And they foiled REvil's plan with a concentrated weekend of effort that's worth mentioning. So REvil had infiltrated the managed service providers via Kaseya BSA, which we talked about. Luckily, Hoppenbrouwer had an HPE snapshot backup that was already in place and backed up all the data until Friday noon. So Hoppenbrouwers ended up returning over 70 terabytes of data across 150 file and application servers, brought back 80% of its devices back for maintenance, monitoring, patching, and was back in business by Monday. And it happened because they used, and I'm not going to say because they used a specific vendor's stuff, but because they had a proper cloud backup in place. Sorry, guys, got carried away.
No,
It's
no,
okay.
that's
We
all
loved
good
your
knowledge.
We loved your thoughts, especially the ones when it comes to authentication and having multiple devices. I'm a big fan of that. But let's go ahead and take a look at more of this data and how do we protect ourselves and our more sensitive data, like information that falls under the HIPAA title. What can we do as far as prevention?
Uh, well, medical data, of course, is interesting, right? Because it's not only sensitive data, but it's also mission critical. And the weird part is that while we're talking about such important data that all falls under the HIPAA guidelines and safety, you use so many applications and data that yet companies are not very good at whitelisting only the secure applications, block the others by default as a part of their zero trust. But even worse is, again, I'm perplexed many a time when I visit a clinic or a hospital where I see pieces of paper everywhere, people still filling in forms, sitting just fine, and sometimes just standing there and filling out forms. And as they're filling out forms, again, you can easily show this have your camera's eyes pointing at what somebody's filling in while you're looking somewhere else and just recording it. The dangerous part, therefore, is what happens when you've got so many instances of data gathering, data collection. Where do you create your first line of prevention? Right? How do you even create that? And frankly speaking, it ought to be a totally digitized setup, but there's a very interesting social stance on this whole set, which is that if you were to turn everything digital to save the identity of the patient and the patient data, you might also, because of the digital divide, end up not providing access to a lot of people who might not have the right technology on hand, and for whom a paper setup is the only thing that they can actually afford and access. And that becomes very tricky. However, if HIPAA data was compromised, there are, this is not from me, but this is directly from HHS. They actually have steps to identify the breach. The first one is, of course, understand the nature and the extent of the protected health information involved, including the type of identifiers and the likelihood of re-identification. Could what has been identified? What parts of the patient data has been identified? Can it be re-identified? Can you basically create a composite of a patient based on that? The second is the unauthorized person who used the protected health information or to whom the disclosure was made. Was it published? Was it just stolen? Could you trace the IP? Of course, the general track and trace protocols. And the third one is whether the protected health information was actually acquired or viewed, which is very interesting, which is was it viewed, was it acquired? And I have to say, I don't think it's a very clever bit of thinking, because nowadays on a digital device, if you view, you could also acquire, right? I could look at it, I could also take a quick picture with my phone. So would that be, how would anybody know if it was just viewed or if it was acquired? Because nobody's going to tell you, you know what, I'm going to take a picture of your form right now. So that I think is a bit iffy. And the final one they say, HHS says, is that the extent to which the risk to the protected health information has been mitigated. Have you come up, have organizations come up with ways to solve it? What steps have they taken? What process re-engineering have they done? What kind of process improvements have they made? What kind of user training have they done? And so forth. So that's my take on HIPAA. It is extremely important, but sadly, the process by which we collect, store, validate, and circulate or share the information is still a very arcane process and a very primitive one, which is waiting to be infiltrated. Not only infiltrated, infiltrate the system, exfiltrate the data.
Rightly so, because I've got relatives in the medical department and across this country, and you you hit it right in the head when there's environments sometimes where there's just papers out there, and you don't know if like someone could just walk by and just screen cap it with their phone from like their pocket or something for like whatever it means they want it for, as well as like the greater extent that the data would be used for if it was taken and used by other perpetrators, or like if it was like connected at all across like a bigger group and the like. But Mike, do you have any more comments on what Dr. Data brought up with HIPAA?
No, I think he did an excellent job at hitting all the key points and everything that needed to be said about HIPAA. It's just it is there. I think there's just a lot of potential for that information to be captured or leaked or taken, and there's just so many access points, like so many ways that you can get your hands on information like that, especially some of the most sensitive information, not only healthcare or stuff that you see in doctors' offices, like it could just be like credit card information that like they have devices. There are like devices out now where you can they can like scan your credit card number like through your wallet, and you have to get like special wallets to block
Yeah, there's like little clear translucent visors that can like block certain
right.
Yes, you talk about those RFID blocking wallets, right? I suppose.
Yes, that's I forgot the name, but yeah,
Yeah, but you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that because frankly speaking, the three of us, we could easily, I don't know easily, but with a little bit of effort, possibly create a setup where every single patient that walks in has to fill every information via a tablet. Even when the nurse sees that information, when somebody presses submit and the nurse sees that information, firstly, there's no paper lying around, no type of human error in trying to re-enter. So you're reducing redundancy because you're not having to re-enter the same data. But even when the nurse or the physician looks at your data, your social security number, your insurance number is automatically obfuscated. Right? It's not very difficult to do something because it's basically just a script that's saying that you're basically just obfuscating certain fields with basically some kind of an obfuscation function that you're calling.
exactly. As it's like a greater span of things with HIPAA, also with the likes of just having like, I remember in my digital security class we did a project based around trying to acknowledge HIPAA, the HIPAA Act, where each of us took upon different aspects of security, and I was delegated to the physical security of this like mock hospital. And even just the physical aspects I looked up when I researched during my last semester at Kent State. It was like, well, not last semester, like third last semester. It was still very comprehensive what just the physical means would be for the best secured facility, even though the best security is 100%, and that's never possible.
True, I totally agree with you, and especially when you see the number of papers flying about at a physician's office or a hospital. You take that seriously? They're practicing HIPAA using that. Haven't they forgotten the central tenet of cybersecurity, which is A lot of the attacks can simply originate from internal members that are employed. And when we go to Europe, you rarely find a steward or a waiter come over and take your card. They bring the machine to you, you put the card in, you take the card out, they hand you the receipt. And in the receipt, your entire card number is obfuscated. Yet we hand over these pieces of paper that's like flying all around the corridors, and people are rushing between doing a triage and getting somebody admitted and this and that. What is the probability, just in general, of somebody forgetting to do proper due diligence?
Indeed.
It's entwined with what we have with the HIPAA data, as when it gets suddenly compromised during an attack, as simple as a phishing might seem to be, or it could be extrapolated into like greater degree. So, what would be like a derived procedure, like for what happens if you become compromised with the HIPAA data?
So if something like HIPAA becomes compromised, actually this is directly from the Office of Health Services. They have very distinct procedures because HIPAA guidelines are well legislated guidelines. What it says, HHS says, is the following. Firstly, you have to identify the nature and extent of the protected health information involved, including the type of identifiers and the likelihood of re-identification. So if that can be used somewhere else and how it could be used somewhere else. The unauthorized person, identify the unauthorized person who used the protected health information or to whom the disclosure was made. Ensure whether the protected health information was actually acquired or viewed. So they have a very distinct bit in terms of whether it's viewed, whether it's acquired. And of course, because it's the government and government people are not very clever in general, they think that acquisition and viewing are two very different things. But the example I just gave you was that you can your camera could be looking at it and recording it. So you could designate it as viewed but not acquired, but because I've recorded it, it's also acquired now. And that makes it dangerous. And then finally, identify the extent to which the risk to the protected health information has been mitigated. Does it give up the entire identity, including all the health identity of the individual or the entity? Is it only partial amounts of data that you've captured, among many different things? So they have these specific 4 steps that you have to figure out. What's the extent of the health information? What kind of identifiers do you know about? Who do you think may have had access to it? Was it acquired or was it just viewed? And to what extent do you think is this whole thing being compromised, or has it only been partly compromised?
Yeah, that it's kind of like how we base like attacks in general, just like basing the scope of things, as well as just like, and something as like prestigious isn't the right word, but as like something as, let's say, precious as the health industry, it'd be really telling us to what we can do with all that in general.
Yes, and it's interesting, because oftentimes the question is not what one person who's collecting that, but there might be multiple people collecting multiple pieces of data, and what they do right after that is just go on a darknet marketplace. There are dedicated criminal groups that just do that. They will all collect data from different sources, collate that data, and create like a patient profile, and then send it and then sell it as simple as an Excel file. on a darknet marketplace like Russian market or Sheep or something like that.
Yeah, because in one of the articles we'll talk about later, that was something that was brought to my mind in one of my newsletters, is that a ransomware group called ReEvil coming back potentially. But we'll get into that in a bit. Before
let's get into our next question here. Dr. Datta, what do you think is the future of ransomware attacks and protection against them?
with the growth of Web 3.0, and even I've heard whispers, like little whispers, about Web 5.0, which I don't know why it skipped like that, but
why did it skip for it? Yeah, interesting.
But with like things like the blockchain and crypto, even though it's not in a good spot right now.
And, I must say, I've never been a fan of the number 4.
Yeah, it has been. There's a lot of cultures that are for number 4, such as my Chinese side of the family doesn't like to use the letter number 4 either. So
I'm joking. I don't care about number 4, but just the way I love fish. I just don't like being fished.
Yeah.
But but beyond that, so going back, if I were to quote from a famous Leonard Cohen song, "I've seen the future, brother, it is murder." But you're talking about the future of ransomware. The future of ransomware is dreadful. Not dreadful for the ransomware attackers, but dreadful for the potential victims. And
they're getting bigger and bigger.
They're getting bigger and bigger, and they're changing the business model altogether. Now, the reason why it's a bit dangerous is because they're starting off with something called RAAS, which is Ransomware as a Service. Now, mind you, the first ransomware attack happened in 1988, when there was a biologist, an evolutionary biologist called Dr. Karl Popper, who did the first ransomware attack in a very, very interesting, clever way. He realized that in 1988, floppy disk, you guys are too young to remember what a floppy disk is, but I remember floppy disks. Floppy disks were still quite expensive, and getting a free floppy disk was always a lovely bonus. And so what he did was, he went to a conference, and he gave away a floppy disk called AIDS Info Disk for free. And of course, conference attendees, very similar to internet users of today, love things that are free, regardless of what's in that. Now, what that floppy did was, the minute you inserted it, it would run and it basically execute a small ransomware program, which, and of course, that point of time, booting and rebooting your computer was very commonplace, right? Every time you finished doing something, you would turn off your computer and then you would reboot it. What he had done in the config and the auto-execute batch file was create a marker that said that on the 98th or 99th, I've actually forgotten exactly which number it was, a reboot, it would simply infect, or it would load the file program right at the boot directory. And now your computer wouldn't start, so it wouldn't say, like your BIOS does a hands-off into your operating system, so your operating system would start. This time the handoff would be to the new batch file, which would say, oh, pay me, I don't know, $1,000 or something. I've actually forgotten how much he asked for, this amount of money. And then I'm going to send you a key that will allow you to erase that batch file and let your computer restart. Now, today, we're talking about, it's all just a little bit of history repeated. We're seeing ransomware, again, being sorted out, but with a slightly different business model, which is ransomware as a service is becoming very much like software as a service, or platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service, where they're saying, We don't want to be in the spotlight too much. Rather, we will create ransomware kits, and from what I've heard, there are even dedicated tutorials and helplines. So somebody could call in and say, I don't like my company, and I think I could get some money out of them. And and the minute you call them, or you link onto them, they'll provide you a custom set of ransomware kits or kit that you can now use, and they'll even tell you, okay, what folders do you have? Can you access in your company? Go into this particular path and embed it there, and you can wreak havoc. You're talking about script kiddies who don't even need to know a lot. Plus, suppose they work with other hackers as affiliates and say that you guys try it out on your own, but give us a cut. Or we'll give you a cut of whatever we make. And I've actually forgotten, it's on that article that I sent you that's just gotten accepted. There's a cut where I think if it's under $500,000 or so, they take I don't know. 40% or 50%, and it's greater than $500,000, then they only take like 30%. So they're setting it up very much like a franchise. You give us the royalty, we give you the goods.
Yeah, it's an odd split with that. It's like it's more organized in a way, because there's still a great proportion of the world that doesn't understand darknet and the dark web, essentially, because people think dark web and they just think like, oh, that's like liveleak.com, rest in peace liveleak.com, and places like the 4chan and like places like that, because there's been like recruitment pages that have been brought up for the group I mentioned earlier on this podcast called ReEvil, that is rumored to be back in the light after being supposedly taken down, in quotes, like 5 sets of quotes, by it's gonna sound weird saying it now, of course, but they were actually taken down by Russia back in January in Ukraine.
By the FSB, I think.
Yeah, by the FSB and the KGB. Kind of like told them like, oh, they're in this building in Ukraine. But it's weird for me saying that, because, of course, with the current situation in Eastern Europe, it's reversed. But it's odd that recruitment for these things is kind of, for less of a better term, allowed online, when like there's like greater extensions for what open coding platforms do, like we have Stack Overflow, GitHub, or even something as far-reaching as WikiHow and the WikiLeaks as well, where people have an open resource and they're like, oh, I can use this, but also, and this is just me truncating here, I kind of feel like I'm gonna be an a-hole today. Can I use this on someone I hate? Along with other softwares and innovations I've seen recently, like the deepfake software, which that gets into dark places with deepfake software, but with ransomware, it's really starting to kind of extend itself into its own little separate being and part of the cybercrime world.
Yes, especially when you start franchising something, and this the ReEvil that you talk about, I think they also call it REvil. I think they've also got a name like Solina Kibi or something like that. What you mentioned with GitHub was the place where Cozy Bear, the hacking outfit, implemented their SolarWinds attack. In the very famous SolarWinds Sunburst attack on the Orion, or the Sunburst malware on the Orion server, that came out of a GitHub, where they added a piece of malware into a GitHub update that SolarWinds typically use, and disguised it as a legitimate update. And the same thing, right? You look at REvil, when REvil what they did was they work off 0-day vulnerabilities,
Yep.
especially for companies that fail to notice what's going on. So I think you were mentioning Kaseya once,
Yeah, they were. That was
and
a ransomware attack that happened to. I think that was last summer or
yep,
before last summer, like in April, as well as a KGB meatpacking plant in Brazil,
yes,
which
yes,
that for
yes.
sure affected a lot of places greatly as well.
Yes, I think that happened at the same time. The meatpacking plant in Brazil happened right when the colonial, or round about that time of SolarWinds, or yeah, before the colonial pipeline attack.
Yeah,
But our evil war is very similar. You know, they all they did was they worked off a flaw in the authentication system in Kaseya, and Kaseya knew about it for 3 months, did nothing, and they exploited it in the wild. And this negligence oftentimes impacts so many, and in Kaseya's case, it was 1,500 clients. So ransomware actors, talking about the future of ransomware, one of the big things that ransomware actors are doing is rather than looking for dedicated clients, they're looking for hub clients, which means clients that produce or offer other services to many other clients. A perfect example was a hacking non-ransomware attack was SolarWinds. They provided infrastructure management services. Kaseya, on the other hand, is a VSA setup, via VSA, Virtual Systems
yeah,
Administration, and they had what, maybe 50 or 60 managed services providers that use them. So when you infect one, it just snowballs, and you end up infecting what, 1,500 people or 1,500 different clients. But you were talking about prevention. There's a very famous story out of a Dutch company called Hoppenbrouwers. It's called the Hoppenbrouwers technique in the Netherlands, and they were one of the Arnival Kaseya attack clients. But when they were hit on a Friday evening when somebody tried to log in and couldn't get access to anything. And then Kaseya informed them that they've been asked to pay $17 million or so in order to get a decryption key. What Hoppenbrouwer did was they said, you know what, we're just calling an immediate meeting of all our employees, asking them. Luckily, what had happened was they had already implemented a backup system, but I think it was HPE, some nimble snapshot or something like that. And that backup system had run right until Friday noon, and everything until Friday noon was backed up. So they ended up moving about 70 terabytes of data and updating from the previous backup set of for like 150 file servers and application servers, and get all these different devices and make sure that they had all these patches, so got back all the 80% of, and in 3 days they were up and running. Didn't pay a single cent, to our evil. And again, the beauty is, if you have a good procedure in place, nothing matters. But if your processes and your users are lax, then of course even the smallest ripple is going to create a massive ransomware tsunami.
right. Because these can get into great extents, which again you can read Dr. Datta's case study of SolarWinds attack on Amazon.com. I actually did it as an assignment. Maybe it was for a final, but regardless. Moving on to the greater tech news, as we talked about the return of ReEvil, which was juxtaposed back in May, which I still haven't gotten any updates on currently as to if they're live or not. Besides one of the perpetrators getting arrested in January again. But these ransomware attacks, like we said, it can go on a grander scale. So I found this piece covered on TheVerge.com, which we like to use a lot for these stories, which includes the U.S. State Department putting a $10 million bounty on Costa Rica because they were victimed to a ransomware attack across their ministries of finance and labor and social security. And yeah, this is a grander scale of things, if I were to say so. If it's like a whole country's departments.
Yeah, this
To
is
say,
this is an interesting story. Did you just want to summarize it for us, Greg? Kind of like what they're saying.
yeah. So this is they've fallen to the group called Conti, CONTI. They're ransomware, but this isn't the first time that ransomware has been used as and this isn't the first time the U.S. has even offered bounties for certain things, such as the aforementioned Revil and DarkSide group, which Dr. Datta actually noted before us earlier on in our today's recording. But this group involved in this attack was also particularly infamous for targeting healthcare facilities, just hospitals and research centers. Even though the group's also renowned for, well, not renowned, known to have its chat logs leaked after it sided with Russia's side of the conflict in Eastern Europe, which take what you will with how that makes them out to be, as these are very nefarious perpetrators, as this is a very intelligent group, I would say so. But it was
is what you're saying here. And so they stole 700 gigabytes of data, right?
Yeah.
And the U.S. is offering, was it up to $10 million for information leading to the identification or location of the organizers behind Conti?
Yeah, the people, anything on the people in the group. And they also, our government, I don't know why I said current, our government is also offering $5 million for information leading to arrest or conviction of any individual or people conspiring or attempting to participate in this attack as well. So I've done my share of looking into cybersecurity attacks, as well as the SolarWinds affair, which was said to also affect our own Department of Defense, which that's kind of scary. But as far back as our first season, where we covered that very attack as well, and the residuals of that.
So this
it's tough to say how this will go.
This is a attack on a government, right? Costa Rica's Ministries of Finance. So there's a lot of important data there that they have access to. So this could be sold on the dark web for lots of money, especially if it's like social securities or other forms of identification. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Datta?
Yeah, I have to say, so it's quite interesting. There's always been bounties. So I'm thinking of more of the socio-political story behind it. I don't know if you've heard of this, but in Russia, there's a dedicated, very expensive part of a neighborhood in Moscow, I think, or I suppose it's in Moscow, called Moscow City, which is known to be famous because you have these multi-millionaires that live there. But there's no difference between the West End of London, where multi-millionaires live, and there, except for the fact that what these multi-millionaires do dramatically is dramatically different. All these multi-millionaires are people who have made money off ransomware attacks. And there's a dedicated part of the city that has all these wealthy people who've made money by pilfering others. But when you start looking at it, regardless of how much bounty somebody offers. The question is the socio-political system where people don't have much. Suddenly you see somebody driving a Mercedes G-Wagon because they can do, they're pretty decent at programming and coding, and they can put their skills into doing something nefarious. Makes it a very lucrative option. If you remember, perhaps 10 years ago, anytime ships sailed through the Horn of Africa, you always worried about Somali pirates. And it's no different, right? You hijack a ship and you ask for ransom, and it's also an extremely impoverished place where hijacking is the most lucrative set. Now, do you know how many times countries have set up bounties for these Somali pirates? You know how many pirates were ever given up? Nearly nobody, because it is a part that meshes in so well with the socio-political scenario. In a place where people don't have much, any way you can get money, especially by pilfering, is perfectly acceptable. Not only is it acceptable, it's to a certain degree, given the fact that oftentimes it's thought to have the blessings of the state. It is oftentimes even thought to be state-sponsored, that it might even be a part of the GRU or the FSB that sponsor these attacks, because at the end of the day, they get a cut and they provide that solid state-based network infrastructure so that they can move across multiple different relays, be able to convert their crypto wallets, including, of course, these non-traceable cryptos like Monero, and then easily convert that, not pay taxes, and live a larger-than-life kind of existence.
Those are some good insights too, especially to the political climate over there. Let's go ahead and jump into our next topic in tech news, which is the Lincoln College. They were permanently closed due to a ransomware attack. I personally think this is very sad, especially since they've been open, I think it was over 157 years.
Yeah, it opened in 1865, and financial troubles and projected enrollment shortfalls were exacerbated with this ransomware attack that happened earlier this year. So I'll kind of summarize this and give both your responses as this is kind of a retrospect story, as it's set to close in December, according to what they said on its own webpage. But it is still the first higher education institution that closed due to a cyber attack, which again is at fault with the increase in ransomware attacks since the beginning of the pandemic of COVID-19. And the attack effectively messed with their recruitment and fundraising efforts, as well as just general extracurriculars amid increased need of investments in technology and safety on campus. So it did not expose sensitive information, which that's a, I don't know, that's a good sign that side of things wasn't exposed, but also this attack effectively just completely rendered all systems required for recruitment inoperable and unreachable by thwarting admission activities and hindering access to all institutional data. So, again, this is just another example of the amount of the scope that ransomware can have, as well as just having the ability to close down whole universities, which is saying something for an institution as old as this Lincoln College, which has survived, as they say, the economic crisis of '87, a fire on campus in 1912, the Spanish flu, Great Depression, and World War II, as well as the last recession. So it's telling what we're gonna go from this, as well as with ransomware not ever really going to sleep lately, and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's telling that it can affect schools because I mean I got a good fair share of cyber knowledge, but it's almost seemed like we need more cyber awareness at colleges. As the most I kind of seen that Kent State even tried was enforcing multi-factor and two-factor authentication, which is it's better than nothing. But
And I think they implemented that while we were there, right? I feel like
yeah, it
a
was
a
like
lot of
right before COVID.
a lot of colleges and a lot of businesses seem to be, um, I don't know, kind of dragging their feet when it comes to getting security systems set up that they should have probably already had set up. I know that um, there was video games that had multiple that I played that had multi-factor authentication before the university did. Um,
Yeah, it's
so I was kind of surprised to see that they were getting it so late. So I think
yeah,
this is just a call out to all the other universities that are kind of dragging their feet on this. It's time to get your ducks in a row, or get your stuff in line, right?
yeah, and I want to jump into this area of this side of ransomware as I find this topic and side of it interesting. As earlier this month, I found a group called Goodwill that is a ransomware group that is telling people to donate to the poor, or by, as the PC Gamer magazine piece calls it, forcing victims to pick five poor children and buy them food, as well as quote, give them a good time and then pay medical bills for a stranger. As the group originates from Mumbai, India. And that brought into the question of what is the current stance with hacktivism. As I remember a video going viral back when I still kind of cared about what happens on Twitter, was I believe it was a group anonymous who put on an op-ed on Elon Musk, almost like aiming their bow and arrow at him, going like, "We know about your secrets. We're gonna look out." And they did a deep dive on Elon for like 2 minutes, and it got kind of viral on Twitter. So I want to know what your guys' takes on with that, as if hacktivism is a good or bad idea. As there's a growth of people just wanting like results, and sometimes that leads into strange wiggle rooms where is the line gonna get crossed with hacktivism?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we have two stories on this today. I don't know how much detail we're gonna go into them on, but there was one where a ransom group forces uh, the victims to pay for uh, food for children, and or take them to KFC. Um,
Yeah, get him KFC.
get them KFC. I don't know how I feel about that. As KFC is not exactly the healthiest choice.
No.
Um, then there was other the other article was about paying bills for something. It was like medical bills, right?
Yeah, it's it was an op-ed with NordVPN actually that tried to continue the conversation of what is our what's the greater morality of this when
I
we have a ransomware group, but it's also helping the poor.
I think
Like,
I think the biggest question we need to ask here is who are they targeting? How do we know that the person they're targeting is a rich person feeding a poor person? Not that that's um the right thing to do. It's just like if they're how do we know that they're really helping someone? Like what if they're just taking money from a poor person and giving it to another poor person for whatever to get their group recognized? You know what I mean?
yeah, I'm wondering like if they're
Or just to
if,
humiliate the person, right?
yeah, just like if they're like, this is how they get off, I guess, with like their ransomware skills, but I don't know,
They're
it's
just
strange.
showing off, right? They're kind of just showing
Yeah,
off. What are your
like,
thoughts on this, Dr. Data? I know you. I talked to you earlier about this, and you had some good points.
Well, again, it sounds. I have a phrase where I say, some things are good from far, but they're far from good. So I would place that in the same category. If it's a world full of Kickstarters, so I don't think there's any dearth of charitable offerings around the world. And if people hear of a cause, they are more than happy to donate to the cause. People who don't even have much will put in a tiny part of whatever they have. And that's why you see Kickstarter campaigns doing so well, especially things that are needed for the needy. But any Tom, Dick, Harry that comes and says, well, I'm going to buy somebody a KFC thing, so I'm going to steal money from somebody to do that. What they forget is that they've already left, I think every time they're using a ransomware kit, they're leaving the kit out in the wild. Now, there is, of course, a very thin red line between doing good and using the same information towards doing bad. And again, I think I was mentioning that Alfred Nobel invented the dynamite. But the dynamite has extracted some of the rarest metals in the world for good, but has also maimed and blown and destroyed lives and families at the same time. The question is the dynamite therefore an essential piece in order to bring balance in society? And same thing, a small spark can light a fire, or and light a candle and help us see in the dark, but a big flash can actually obliterate the entire earth. The question is, the minute ransomware is not just a single phenomena. It is actually the utilization of a malicious kit that you are now pushing out into the mainstream for a purpose. Now, whether that purpose is fulfilled, how good that purpose was, the vicissitudes of that is beyond the story. What remains, though, is that kit is still there, and some other person can easily pick up that kit and not be a Robin Hood, DarkSide. That the nefarious hacking group DarkSide has also been famous for talking about giving to the water project and what's it called, Children International, doing charitable donations. That doesn't mean anything whatsoever. It basically means that they have a kit which they have used for extortion. Anytime you're extorting something, whether you're extorting something for good or bad, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters, at least for me, is the fact that you're extorting. If you're talking about hacktivism, I really would like to support groups like Anonymous, who don't want money, who don't want to extort, rather they take up a cause and they rally people against the cause. For example, I think right after Russia invaded Ukraine, what was around the 24th of February or so of this year, of 2022, Anonymous ended up hacking over 2,500 or so Russian and Belarusian websites. And they work in terms of supporting Ukraine by decrying any kind of propaganda that these countries might be engaged in. And they have these Polish activist groups that join them called Squad 303 or something like that. The Belarusian cyber partisans that doesn't like the fact that Belarus is so tightly tallying up with Russia because they want to get a tiny share of whatever loot comes out of Ukraine and create a better corridor or something like that. That, for me, makes more sense. But the minute you're talking about getting money out, you're no longer talking about a kid. You're talking about a kid that actually extorts. But the minute you've created a kit, you can't take it back. It's there, and it's there for anybody to do anything dangerous that they want with it. If that's just my humble thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, because interesting points there. As I've heard about Anonymous doing that in the Russia conflict, as well as just 2 years ago, I believe they took down the Minneapolis Police Department website during the crux of the BLM movement. So
that I don't know if that's the right thing to do or not, but that we won't get into my own political propensities.
Yeah.
Because there's like always this. It's in recent times I've seen people dance around the subject of shades of gray with good and what's bad. With I don't know how if this connects well, but like I used to watch the show Mr. Robot, and that it was about a cyber activism group called F_Society with Rami Malek and Christian Slater helming the group. And multiple times, they kind of try to lean into the part that this is kind of. It went from saying like, "Oh, this is for the general good because we're trying to get this hospital that's treating people on this important medication." So this attack is utilitarian good. That's what Christian Slater's character kept telling him. And then over time, it spirals into this let's just destroy stuff because we can. So I don't know. There's always a weird nuance with that sort of thing, but with cases like this that I found really compelling. With I kind of agree with your point where it's like you can't have someone that's like a very bad person, but if they give to like Feeding America, they're suddenly good all of a sudden. Like if you rob a bank and you rob like $2 million from the bank, but you give like 500,000 of it to Feeding America randomly, then it's not going to clear you of like all your they're running your ledger, so to speak. But Mike, do you have any other final thoughts on this goodwill group?
I think you guys have a really interesting perspective on it, and I think this is very on a case by case basis. Like some of this, sometimes you're gonna be like, oh yeah, they did a good thing. Like whatever, whether it's feeding the poor or paying for medical bills, but like I think on some level you're rewarding people for breaking the law, and you can't have both. You can't be like, yo, it's good that you helped these people, but you also broke the law. You know what I mean? You can't be like, you know what I mean? So there has to be. I think you kind of have to be like, yo, let's find another way to do this. You know, let's find another way to help people without breaking the law. So
It's like an attempt at rebranding, but it's also like trying to say like, oh come on, don't point fingers at me. Look, I'm kind of helping.
yeah, at first it got me excited because like it's great they're helping people. I'm good. It's good to see these people getting the help they need. But I think Dr. Day really hit it on the head with at what point does this stop? At what point is this not just just the tip of the iceberg? As I say. But let's go ahead. You said you mentioned rebranding, and I think we have another article on that, right?
Yeah. So I have a piece, our last piece here with ransomware hacking groups to continue with our today's episode's theme, where groups have learned to just kind of sidestep or dodge roll for those that like Dark Souls sanctions from countries like our own United States by kind of just rebranding their software, such as this group Evil Core, which was under sanctions with the U.S. authorities. because it was the U.S. authorities that said, "Oh, Evil Corp is responsible for this ransomware called Wasted Locker." Evil Corp responded by just saying, "Okay, uh, we have other variants of it," and then they put that as like their most on poster thing that they use to kind of just skirt the lines of the sanctions, as these new strains, so to speak, are now the most prevalent. Even though, as a director of cybercrime analysis puts it, Evil Corp kind of hide behind this very well-known public brand in order to receive payments from the victims, but most of them are not going to have a clue as to this is tied to any sanctioned actor. As this is the great scope of things with regarding what if more hackers can do this to just kind of not be fallen under sanctioned label, but it's saying something when it gets a scope. I gotta stop saying scope. It gets the attention. It gets the attention of like what our own government's looking at, or at least big players in the business world are finding, such as Bill Seigel, CEO of this company named Coveware that helps victims of ransomware. That he's noticed ransomware hackers changing up the design of the programs that they're sanctioned to just say if their brand is as effectively cooked, they need to either find another line of work to try or rebrand themselves to obfuscate their identity and hope that nobody links them together. Kind of like a mask system.
Where they're just putting on another mask, right?
Where it's like, oh, I'm not
branding their whole organization is what you're saying. Every time they get someone gets close to discovering them.
Or they have like a software and it's like, yeah, we know that group, we know the name, and we know what software to use. Let's get them. And by the time the U.S. Department has time to get the resource to get them, they're like, oh, they're not really using it anymore. They haven't used it in a few months now. What are they using now? Oh, I don't know. Let's find that out now again. It kind of, you see how it like prolongs the process of getting them when they do the rebranding.
Understandable. So it's definitely something to look out for and keep an eye on. I think this is Dr. Datta, do you have any thoughts on this?
No. It sort of ties very nicely in terms of how you guys were chatting about a few hacking and ransomware groups rebranding themselves as we end up helping children and the ones in need. In this case, they're rebranding themselves by tweaking pieces of the software or the package itself or the deployment itself or just the name itself, right? So everybody's trying to evade the long arm of the law by either pleading to either human sensibilities or human softness, yet while carrying out nefarious activities, or taking a shorter cut and simply saying, okay, we've got a different name now. The name that you really wanted us for is now gone. So our worst days are behind us. We're totally reformed. See, we're totally born again right now.
Yeah. Before I got into technology, I was into sports a bit, and a lot of times when a player got in trouble, they would rename themselves to something to just asphyxiate what they did before, such as there's a good documentary about this guy, Ron Artest. He was involved in the Malice at the Palace, good documentary on Netflix on that same subject, and he had anger problems, so to kind of rebrand himself, he had to become a meta world peace. That was one of his names at one point, as well as something as simple as just changing, or the mask system I talked about, like when someone would just say like, oh, I'll just change my number on my jersey. They won't know. But kind of going full circle with this, thank you, Dr. Datta, for joining us today.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us and listening to our podcast. Dr. Day, would you like to shout out your socials or your channels or any?
I'm too antisocial to have a social or a channel,
Understandable.
but no, I think you've got a link to my what do you call it, the Google Scholar page, and my general information should be right out there. Thank you very much. I absolutely enjoyed our discussion and our chat, and looking forward to more conversations.
Right on, right on. Thank you for having us, and thank you all for listening. Make sure you guys stay vigilant.
Stay vigilant.
Will do, will do. I'm going to lock up all the doors as we speak. Joking. All right, take care. Bye. Happy Father's Day.
Bye.
Bye.